All right, so this is the graphing cosine lesson. If you're following along in your packet still, I believe it's lesson 7 at this point. So it says yesterday, should be last week now. So last week we used the unit circle to find the values that were needed to graph sine of x. So if you remember, here was our circle. We have 0 degrees and 360. We have 90 degrees, 180, 270. Remember, these we ended up using radians, so that was really 0 and 2 pi. 90 degrees, remember converting was pi over 2. 180 was pi, and 270 was 3 pi over 2. So if you need to go back to last Monday's lesson, and you could see we did all those conversions. Then each one of these has a point where the unit circle hits the x and y axis. So over at the 0, 360 or 0, 2 pi was the point 1, 0. Up at the top was 0, 1. Then over at the 180 or pi, we had negative 1, 0. And down at the bottom was 0, negative 1. So because this is the unit circle, remember that our points x and y are cosine, comma, sine. So today we're going to look at cosine as its own function. So that means we're going to be looking at the x's for each of these. So my x's would be that 1, 0, negative 1, and 0 again. So filling in the table, when our angle, remember x, these are the thetas, these are the angles we're going to be using. So when my angle is 0, that's over on the right, the x coordinate for it for cosine is 1. When my angle is pi over 2, that's up at the top of the unit circle, the x coordinate is 0. Remember, I also gave you an easier way to find these. I said you could use your calculator. Just make sure, again, if you go to mode, that you have radian mode turned on, that the black box is around radian. So here again is that cosine of 0 that we just did, cosine of pi divided by 2 that we just did. So the next one in the table is cosine of pi. So we get negative 1. You can continue using the unit circle if you want. So if you see there's that negative 1. Or you can use the calculator. That might be the easier option, to be honest. So now we're going to do 3 pi over 2. So on the calculator, cosine of 3 pi divided by 2, you should get 0. And then last, 2 pi, cosine of 2 pi, we get 1 again. Now, these 5 points, this 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1, these are cosines, critical points. So remember when we graphed sine, we had those 5 critical points for sine. So we'll go over them up at the top. Sine's critical points. Remember I said technically they should be memorized, but obviously right now you can just keep referring to your paper. But sine's critical points were 0, 1, 0, negative 1, and 0. Cosine's critical points are this 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and 1. So we are going to be using these critical points every time we graph, so make sure that you do know them. So sine and cosine each have their own set of critical points. So graphing, my x's, those angles, I'm going to graph each one of them. So we have 0, then pi over 2, then pi, then 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. I have room to skip again. Notice again the biggest number in that cosine list is +1 and the smallest is -1, just like sines. So now I want to plot each of these points. So first one is 0, 1. Then at pi over 2, we're at 0. Then at pi, we're down at -1. Then 3 pi over 2, we're back at 0. And then 2 pi, we're back up at 1. Now, again, these points are coming from the unit circle. There are no straight lines on a circle. So just like sine, I said, do not graph with straight lines. Same thing here for cosine. It kind of looks like it's a V shape. However, when we connect them with a curve. So it should be curved. It should look, remember we said that sine was cyclical. Cosine is cyclical as well. So if I were to continue this graph, it would keep going again and again in the same shape. It ends up, if you were to keep extending it, it looks like sine. They're just both curved and they keep waving on and on as you continue. If I wanted to continue this on the negative side, I could. We have negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, negative 2 pi. Again, negative pi over 2, if you want to use your calculator, cosine of negative pi divided by 2 is at 0. Then the negative pi, I could do cosine of negative pi. I get -1. Cosine of negative 3 pi over 2 is 0. And then cosine of negative 2 pi is 1 again. So connecting, you see it does just continue. Again, I could go past that if I wanted to, and we have this never-ending wave that's going on with cosine. However, the big thing that we're going to look at right here from the 0 to 2 pi for this graph, this is my one cycle. This is what one cycle of cosine looks like. So just make sure that you know the difference between the two. Cosine's one cycle looks like this. Sine's one cycle looks like this. So make sure you notice the difference between the two. You should be able to look at a graph and identify which one is which. Notice the midline for cosine is right here. Remember, midline means that you need an equal amount of the graph above as you have below. We're always going to start our graphs on the y-axis. So if you notice, cosine does not start on the midline. Cosine will never start on the midline, whereas if you go back and re-look at the lesson from last Monday, I said sine always starts on the midline. So if I did draw in my midline here, sine would be starting on it, whereas cosine starts off of it. So that is important to know. So here we have the same general form as we had for sine. The only difference is now instead of that saying sine, it says cosine. A, B, C, and D still stand for the same pieces. A is still the amplitude. B is still the frequency. which remember frequency is how many cycles are completed in a length of 2 pi. C is still the phase shift, which remember is the horizontal shift. And D is still the vertical shift. Every time we graph these, just like with sine, you don't have to worry about graphing the phase shift. You would just have to recognize it if you see an equation that contains one. So if we look on the next side here, we are going to sketch one cycle of cosine. And again, notice the C piece is missing. We're not going to be graphing with that phase shift. Sketching, we are still going to follow half pi that I used for sine. The A, remember, gets you your x's, your y's, whereas the FPI gets you your x's. So number 1, sketch one cycle of y equals 3 cos 2x. So we're going to be following the exact same steps. You're going to see there is one piece that is different, and it's really just the numbers you're using are different. Otherwise, the steps are exactly the same as last week, which is why we took so long to go over graphing sine to make sure we understood it. So the A, that is asking you again for the amplitude. That is asking you for the number in front of the cosine. So in this case, 3. And just like last week, we said we take that A and we multiply it with our critical points. So now here's the only part that's different. We're using different critical points. Sine had its own critical points, and now cosine has its own critical points. So those were those points that I highlighted in the table for you. Those are the points that we are using. So 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. And they are all getting multiplied with this 3. So 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 0, 3 times -1, 3 times 0, and then 3 times 1 again. So these here are my y's. So if you wanted to make a table like we had on the front, these are the y's that we are going to be using. So to get the x's, I said that's the FPI. F, remember, stands for the frequency, which is the number in front of the x. So that is the B, which is 2. P stands for the period, which is not in the equation. However, if you remember the formula, it was 2 pi divided by the frequency. So 2 pi divided by 2 in this case is pi. And then I is the increment. It is what we are going to count by on the x-axis. It was the period divided by 4. So pi divided by 4, or we could say 1 pi divided by 4. Now, we're always going to start on the y-axis. So the first x we're going to use is always going to be 0. And then that I is what we count by. So remember, the next one would then be the 1 pi over 4, plus another 1 pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4, plus another 1 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4, plus another 1 pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4, and if you simplified, it should equal your period. So 4 pi over 4 is pi. So graphing these, there's my 0. I should have room to skip every other line again. My y's have to get up to positive 3 and down to negative 3. So that I have to just go each line one at a time. Now plotting the points. When x is 0, y is 3. When x is 1 pi over 4, y is 0. When x is 2 pi over 4, y is negative 3. When x is 3 pi over 4, y is 0. And when x is 4 pi over 4, y is positive 3. So connect with a curve again, and there is your cosine graph. B, we're going to do the same thing. So following my steps of f pi. A, in this case, it's negative 1. And again, we're going to multiply our critical points. 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. Each one is getting multiplied by negative 1. So negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. Negative 1 times 0 is 0. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 times 0 is 0. And negative 1 times 1, negative 1. Now, these are giving me my y values. Remember, your vertical shift also affects your y values. It says plus 3 here, so I'm going to add 3 to all of these, just like what we had done with sine. Again, the only difference between this lesson and the lesson from last Monday is these 5 critical points that you're using. It's just a different set of numbers. Otherwise, the steps and everything are exactly the same. So negative 1 plus 3 is 2. 0 plus 3 is 3. 1 plus 3 is 4. 0 plus 3 is 3. And negative 1 plus 3 is 2. So these are my y's. Again, if you want to make yourself a table to use, go for it. To get the x's, again, that is the rest of f pi. F, the frequency, is 1/2. P, the period, the formula, remember, is 2 pi divided by the frequency. So 2 pi divided by 1/2. Be careful when you're dealing with the fractions, with division. This is where we tend to make our mistakes. If you want to use your calculator, again, remember, no pi goes into the calculator. And you'll do 2 divided by 1/2 and put the 1/2 in parentheses because it's its own fraction. So we should get 4. And then we'll throw the pi into our answer. So 4 pi. And then I, the increment, what we're going to count by on the x-axis, is the period divided by 4. So the period was 4 pi divided by 4 gets us pi, or 1 pi. So on the table, remember the first x, just like with sine, is always 0. And then we're going to count by 1 pi or pi. So the next one will be 1 pi, plus another 1 pi will be 2 pi, plus another will be 3 pi, plus another will be 4 pi. So labeling, here's our 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Remember, this last one should be your period, which it is. And now we should be able to skip every other line because I have to get all the way up to positive 4. So plotting my points, when x is 0, y is 2. When x is 1 pi, y is 3. When x is 2 pi, y is 4. When x is 3 pi, y is 3. And when x is 4 pi, y is 2. Again, no straight lines. connect with a curve. And there's your cosine graph. If I asked you for the midline, here would be my midline. Again, remember cosine does not start on the midline, so it's starting off of it. And remember your midline is equal to your vertical shift. So our vertical shift was +3, so that's our midline. Notice this cosine graph is flipped upside down. That's because of the negative in front. So just all important things that you should notice about your graph. Any questions, please reach out to me and ask. I can help you. I would rather be able to help you than have you be stuck. This is where you're going to start in college algebra and pre-calculus next year, so you do have to understand this topic. So please let me know if you have any questions. Enjoy the rest of your day and get outside for a little bit because it's beautiful out.